Good morning, all, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share a subject very close to my heart. I asked to have this presentation scheduled for March, as it is the birth month of two prominent American Indians, centuries apart, Pocahontas and Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce. We'll start with a brief but painful survey of toxic interactions between American Indians, or Native Americans if you prefer, and white people from the early 19th to the mid 20th centuries. On the more positive side, as events of the 1950s and the 1970s increased the visibility of Native nations, many of the almost 300 American Indian tribes moved to recover the languages and the cultures and spirituality that American whites had tried so hard to eradicate in the 19th century. Perhaps the best way of starting this is with reference to an experience I had shortly after my arrival in San Miguel. It seemed that almost everyone had either just returned from India or was about to go. For some reason, I asked what they knew about other people called Indians, namely American Indians. The usual reply was lack of interest, saying that there were hardly any left. End of conversation. In fact, there are over 5 million American Indians in the USA. That led me to reflect upon my half century of experience with Native Americans and upon American Indians' experience with white Americans over the past 2 centuries. The American experiment in Indian displacement and extermination did not go unnoticed elsewhere in the world. It was the inspiration for Adolf Hitler's final solution, which is why I call it the American Holocaust. Thus, the history of the first 3/4 of the interaction, starting with the Trail of Tears in the 1830s, is simply too sad to lend itself to a brief summary, but I'll try. The first of many massive forced migrations was the Trail of Tears in 1838, in which a mass of Indian tribes, collectively referred to as the 5 civilized tribes, that is the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminoles, and they were living as autonomous nations. They were forced to move to what is now Oklahoma, then called Indian Territory. Other tribes not native to Oklahoma were subsequently resettled, not too peaceably, in Indian Territory until 1889, when Oklahoma was opened to white settlement, from which the name Sooner is derived. Time forbids going into detail about this. Meanwhile, as the war between the states drew to a close, national US attention was shifted to the Southwest. Tribes such as those of the Apache and the Navajo, which had once been a single people, received special treatment. The Navajo's tragic long walk was actually 53 long walks between 1862 and 1866, forced them from their western New Mexico homeland to the desolate Bosque Redondos of eastern New Mexico, during which, and their subsequent diaspora, many died. Once estimated at some 25,000 in number, only about 2,000 remained when they were allowed to return to their homeland in 1868. Gold fever generated other genocidal massacres. First, as an almost halving of the Indian population of California after the 1849 gold rush. Later, to protect the Black Hills, Colonel George Armstrong Custer's divisions were decimated. Partly in reaction to this, the US government attempted to stamp out indigenous cultures and religious ceremonies, particularly the sun dance. It was this policy which led to the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890, when the US military killed some 300 barely armed natives, as a result of which 20 soldiers were awarded Congressional Medals of Honor. Just 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks before today, action was taken at the national level to rescind these Medals of Honor over 130 years after they had been awarded for participation in a massacre. After Wounded Knee, the American Holocaust began to wind down. The 20th century gave birth to some positive events, partially as a result of their distinguished service during World War I. American Indians were granted citizenship by the federal government in 1924. Unfortunately, this was not recognized by all states, nor did it change their economic status at the bottom of the totem pole. Following World War II, during which American Indians' their distinguished service was made visible through the fame of the code talkers, attention was again drawn to the, in quotes, Indian problem. Forgetting that the Indians, by treaty, had been guaranteed governmental support in exchange for surrendering some of their reservation lands, they were viewed as being on undeserved welfare. What to do with those who had not accepted individual allotments of land under the General Allotment Act of 1887? To summarize briefly, the legal actions taken by the federal government from the 1950s on ranged from relocation of Indians to cities to outright termination of Indians. Yes, that's what it was called, the simple abolition of reservations and the label Indian. So we come to a later turning point in relations between Indians and the federal governments. Anti-imperialist reactions of the Middle Eastern nations in the 1970s allowed some Indians to strike back. It was the energy crisis of that period which caused the federal government to look at the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. Considered valueless in the mid-19th century, there it turned out were the dominant sites of two critical energy resources, hard coal and uranium, lying under Indian reservations. White folk, who were called Anglos, or Indians, thought that the way to get rapid access to these resources was by waging an energy war against the tribes. But as the oil-rich Middle Eastern countries had discovered strength in numbers, so did the Indians whose reservations were located on the Front Range. They formed a union of tribes that came to be known as CERT, C-E-R-T, which is unrelated to the breath mints. It was the Council of Energy Resource Tribes, demanding the right to negotiate with the federal government independent of the incompetent Bureau of Indian Affairs. The federal government retaliated by declaring large sections of the Front Range and the American Southwest as, in quotes, national sacrifice areas that were not subject to the same mining safeguards as elsewhere in the USA. American Indians working in uranium mines were given no information about dangers of radioactivity, nor were they issued adequate protective gear. Most later died of radiation-induced cancer. Federal government's attempt to completely eliminate reservations was unsuccessful. While a number of them were terminated, they have been since restored, not all, but many of them. And here are some voices that say something about the American Indians' own view of their reservation and reservation life.
Bleak.
Oppression.
Small.
Small. They're beautiful and sad at the same time. It's beautiful because you're surrounded by people that are just like you. But it's sad because everything that affects big cities, whether it's drugs or alcohol or everything's magnified on a reservation. You see it up front, like in your face.
Yeah. Prison. It's like where we're trapped.
What do you think is the most common misconception about reservations?
That there's some kind of abundance, that natives are happy, that they're caring for each other, that they live in some ancient way.
Unfair, because they're not as good as other lands. They're the land that the government and people don't want.
Trapped. It wasn't great farmland, it wasn't great homeland. And so it kind of feels like a place off to the side.
There are no good reservations. Here's your reservation. You can't go across that boundary. This is your reservation. And I grew up on a Navajo reservation, and we're one of the few lucky people that got to remain where our homelands are. But there are other reservations where people were forced there, and they can't fend for themselves like they used to do in the old days. You can't hunt anymore, you can't fish anymore, because you're just stuck on a reservation on these substandard housing, living in third world country conditions. Youths killing themselves because there's no future, there's no hope. That's a reservation to me.
Another important milestone was 1978 when the American Indian Religious Freedoms Act was passed, ending a century and a half of forced acculturation, finally recognizing their right to their indigenous religious practices and beliefs. From this point on, we'll concentrate upon life and spirituality of the most numerous American Indian tribes, Navajo, whose reservation spans 3 southwestern US states. I began working with them in 1968, continuing on and off until a few years ago. After the arrival of Spanish colonists many centuries ago, the Navajo became primarily shepherds, enabling them to create the rugs for which they became famous. Dogs trained to be shepherds thus became tremendously valuable. Here now is a song that Sylvia and I learned years ago, the puppy song, about a little girl and her puppy, sung by school children in Utah.
Yaate.
We are the Nebo School District Title VII Indian Education Program.
And this is Slay Chant Yaje, the puppy song. Navajo life also revolves about their traditional history, which adheres inextricably in their landscape. In the words of Willie Gray Eyes, these lands offer a form of healing that we want people to accept so that we can live in harmony together. Leonard Gordon says, Navajo human rights are centered on place. In our sense, we're here and we're not going anywhere. Thus, the environment is incorporated into spirituality, represented in their multi-day curing ceremonies. Entrances to their traditional houses, which are called hogans, must face east so that the person saying the morning prayer may face the rising sun. Fundamental to the Navajo culture is the concept of hosho, which is harmony, to living in beauty and walking in beauty. As opposed to the other Navajo, or they call themselves Dine, as opposed to the other Navajo chant ways, which are used to effect a cure to a problem or sickness, the blessing way, hosho, is used to bless the one person who is sung over, the person being cured, to ensure harmony. Above all, this is part of hosho, who's good luck, good health, and blessings for all that pertains to them. Here is one translation of a small part of the closing chant of the blessing way ceremony. In beauty I walk, with beauty before me I walk, with beauty behind me I walk, with beauty above me I walk, with beauty around me I walk. It has become beauty again. Today I will walk out. Today everything negative will leave me. I will be as I was before. I will have a cool breeze over my body. I will have a light body. I will be happy forever. Nothing will hinder me. That is part of the Blessing Way ceremony, and I've been pleased to be able to present that part. I did not give you the original Navajo. Whenever I ask Navajos about what's most important to Navajos, the answer was invariably the same: land and language. And here's the book that resulted from that research. It resulted, both of these concepts are essentially spiritual attachments. And my interest is the relation between the two, which led to a 12-year project, which resulted in this book, published in 2019, called An Illustrated Dictionary of Navajo Landscape Terms. Now you've heard the Blessing Way, and I wish that your way shall be blessed.